April 11, 1947, San Quentin State Prison. A 66-year-old woman walks into the gas chamber. Her name is Louise Peete. She is only the second woman California has ever put to death this way. Here is the strange part. This is not her first murder conviction. Years earlier, she served 18 years in prison for a killing that looked almost exactly like this one. A body was found buried under an avocado tree. A husband jumped from the 9th floor of a building, and when the judge sentenced her to death, Louise did not cry. She did not scream. She simply opened a book and kept reading. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is where we uncover the darkest true crime cases in history. Hit subscribe, because what happened before Louise ever reached that gas chamber is almost impossible to believe. Stay until the end. You will not see the ending coming. Margaret Logan was a kind woman. She was retired, elderly, and lived a quiet life in Pacific Palisades with her husband Arthur. Margaret had spent much of her career as a social worker. She believed people could change. She believed in second chances, even for people the world had already judged and locked away. That belief is how she met Louise Peete. While Louise sat in prison for the murder of Jacob Denton, Margaret began visiting her. She grew close to her. She believed, deeply and sincerely, that Louise was innocent. So Margaret did what she always did. She fought for her. She lobbied for Louise's parole, year after year, until it finally happened in 1939. Margaret's kindness did not stop there. While Louise was locked away, Margaret and Arthur helped care for Louise's own daughter, Betty. Think about that. The woman who would one day take Margaret's life was, at the same time, raising her daughter with her own hands. By the early 1940s, Arthur's health had declined. He suffered from dementia. He needed constant care. Margaret, now older herself, needed help. So she turned to the one person she trusted completely, Louise Peete. Margaret welcomed Louise into her home as a live-in housekeeper and caregiver for Arthur. It was an act of pure charity. A woman who had spent her life helping others was now inviting a convicted murderer to live under her own roof. Margaret Logan believed she was giving Louise a second chance at life. Instead, she was giving her the opportunity to end one. Louise Peete was not born Louise Peete at all. Her real name was Lophie Louise Preslar. She was born in September of 1880, in Bienville, Louisiana. Her father was a wealthy newspaper publisher. She grew up with money, education, and social standing. She often reminded people of this. She once said she came from cultured, educated people. She wanted the world to see her as refined, and for most of her life, the world did. Louise was well-spoken. She was charming. She carried herself like a woman of good breeding. Even behind prison walls, she kept up this image. During her 18 years in custody, she worked as a dental assistant. She tended the prison's flower garden. She wrote for the prison newspaper. Officials called her a model prisoner. But underneath that polished surface was a pattern that stretched back decades. By the time Margaret Logan met her, Louise was already serving a life sentence for the 1920 murder of a wealthy mining engineer named Jacob Denton. That alone should have been a warning. But there were other warnings too, quieter ones, buried in her past. Multiple husbands who crossed paths with Louise ended up dead. Officially, their deaths were ruled suicides. Unofficially, the pattern was hard to ignore. When Louise was finally paroled in 1939, she legally changed her name. She became Anna Lee, a new name, a clean slate. No one connected her to the woman convicted of murder years earlier. After her release, 2 women opened their homes to her. First, Jessie Marcy, who had lobbied for her freedom. Then Emily Latham, her own probation officer. Both women took Louise in. Both women died shortly after. No one raised questions. No one connected the pattern. Louise Peete, or Anna Lee, walked free. And soon, she would find her next home. Margaret and Arthur Logan were waiting. Louise moved into the Logan home in Pacific Palisades and quickly made herself indispensable. She managed the household. She managed Arthur's medication. She managed the family's finances. Margaret, trusting as always, handed over control without a second thought. But Louise was not just caring for Arthur. She was building a story. She began telling neighbors that Arthur had violent fits. She said he grew aggressive without warning. She said Margaret and she were both in danger from him. Not one of these claims had been reported before Louise arrived. Not one of them came from anyone but her. This was not concern. This was preparation. Louise was planting a narrative long before she needed one. No one questioned it. No one asked why a woman managing an elderly couple's money and medicine had never disclosed her past. No one checked her name against court records. No one knew that Anna Lee and Louise Peete were the same person. In May of 1944, Louise added another name to her life. She married a banker named Lee Borden Judson. She never told him about her prior conviction. She never told him about the life sentence she had served for murder. Judson believed he was marrying an ordinary woman. Instead, he was marrying into something he could not see coming. By the middle of 1944, everything was in place. Louise controlled the Logans' money. She controlled their household. She had already told neighbors a story that pointed suspicion away from herself and toward a sick, elderly man who could not defend himself. Margaret Logan had no idea what was coming, and what happens next is impossible to believe. Louise Peete did not need a partner in crime. Court records later confirmed that her husband, Lee Judson, had no idea what she was planning. He was not a co-conspirator. He was simply a man standing too close to a woman with a hidden past. Louise did not need help because she already had everything she needed. She had access to the Logans' bank accounts. She had keys to every room in the house. She had control over the mail, the money, and the medicine. She had spent months building this position, one small task at a time, until Margaret and Arthur depended on her for almost everything. There was a firearm, too. Investigators never publicly traced where it came from, but the method matched something from Louise's past. It was strikingly similar to the way Jacob Denton had died 24 years earlier. The signs were there, if anyone had looked. Bank employees would later recall something odd about the checks coming from the Logan household. The signatures did not look quite right. They looked rushed, uneven, slightly wrong. At the time, no one thought much of it. It was just paperwork, just numbers moving through a bank on an ordinary day. No one connected it to danger. No one connected it to Louise. But a paper trail was already forming, quietly, in the background. It would not be found for months. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. How do you think Louise Peete controlled two households, two elderly people, and an entire bank account without anyone stopping her? Type your theory in the comments below. And if this story has you hooked already, hit that like button and subscribe, because the next part is where everything changes. On June 1st, 1944, Margaret Logan followed her usual routine. She moved through her home in Pacific Palisades the way she had for years. Simple tasks, quiet days, nothing out of the ordinary. Then, sometime that day, Margaret Logan vanished. There was no scream reported by any neighbor. There was no call for help. No one dialed for the police. In a quiet neighborhood, on an ordinary day, a woman simply disappeared, and no one outside that house heard a single sound. Court records later revealed what actually happened to Margaret. She had been shot in the back of the neck. She also suffered a skull fracture. This was not the description of a wild, sudden attack. This was close range. This was targeted. This was not the fit of rage that Louise would later try to describe. But at the time, no body had been found. No investigation had begun. All anyone had was Louise's word. And Louise's word kept changing. First, she told neighbors that Margaret had gone into seclusion. Then she added a detail. She said Arthur, in one of his violent fits, had attacked Margaret and bitten her nose so badly that she needed to hide her face. Margaret, Louise explained, had gone away quietly to undergo plastic surgery. Each version added a new layer. Each version moved suspicion further away from Louise and further onto a sick, elderly man who could not speak for himself. 3 days after Margaret vanished, Louise made her next move. She had Arthur Logan committed to Patton State Hospital. To do it, she lied. She claimed to hospital staff that she was his foster sister. It was not true, but it worked. With Arthur locked away in a hospital bed, the one other person who might have asked hard questions about Margaret's absence was gone too. There was no one left in that house to contradict Louise. No one left to notice what was missing. No one left to say, something is wrong here. For 6 months, Margaret Logan's disappearance sat unquestioned. Neighbors accepted the story about seclusion and surgery. Bills were paid. Life in the neighborhood continued as if nothing had happened. But underground, in the backyard of that quiet Pacific Palisades home, the truth was already buried. It would take 6 long months and a completely unrelated discovery before anyone dug deep enough to find it. With Margaret gone and Arthur locked away, Louise Peete moved quickly. To the neighbors, the story stayed simple. Margaret was in seclusion. She was recovering from plastic surgery after Arthur's alleged attack had left her disfigured. It was a story built to buy time, and it worked. Behind that story, Louise began helping herself to everything the Logans owned. She forged checks in Margaret's name. She took control of the couple's bank accounts. Money moved out of the household steadily, month after month, with no one left to stop it. There was no family standing nearby to ask questions. Margaret had lived a quiet life, somewhat isolated from close relatives. That isolation, the very thing that once made her lean on Louise for company and help, was now the same thing protecting Louise from being caught. On December 6, 1944, Arthur Logan died at Patton State Hospital. He never left. He never recovered. He never got the chance to tell anyone what he knew, if he knew anything at all. Louise's final act toward him was chillingly practical. She donated his body to science. There would be no funeral to raise questions, no burial to examine later, no family gathered to notice something was wrong. Arthur Logan was gone, quietly and completely, closing off any chance of the truth coming out through him. Margaret was buried in secret. Arthur was gone for good, and Louise Peete was still walking free. For months, no one investigated Margaret Logan's disappearance. There was no case, no detective assigned, no official reason to look closer. That changed because of a bank employee. Court records show that a routine review of the Logans' accounts turned up a forged check. Something about the signature did not match. It was a small detail, a clerical red flag. But it was enough to bring in the police. Once investigators started asking questions, Louise's story began to crack. She told them Margaret had gone into seclusion for surgery. Then she offered another version. Arthur, she said, had killed Margaret himself, in what she called a homicidal frenzy. The stories did not match each other. They did not hold up under basic questioning. Yet Louise did not panic. Observers who spoke with her during this period described her as calm, unnervingly calm. She sat through interviews with the same composure she had carried her entire adult life. She answered questions without hesitation, even when the answers made no sense together. At this point, investigators had no idea who they were truly dealing with. They knew her as Anna Lee, a quiet caretaker with a missing employer, and a strange story. No one had yet connected her to Louise Peete, the woman convicted of first-degree murder back in 1921. The past and the present had not collided yet, but they were about to. On December 20, 1944, police searched the Logan property in Pacific Palisades. They did not have to search long. Buried in a shallow grave beneath an avocado tree in the backyard, they found the body of Margaret Logan. 6 months after she vanished, the truth was finally pulled out of the ground. The autopsy became the turning point. Margaret had been shot in the back of the neck. She had also suffered a skull fracture. There was no version of Louise's stories, not the seclusion, not the surgery, not the homicidal frenzy that matched what the evidence showed. Every excuse she had given collapsed at once. Louise Peete was arrested within hours. Her husband, Lee Judson, was arrested too. Investigators believed, at least at first, that he might have known something, but there was no evidence tying him to the murder. On January 11, 1945, he was released. He did not get far. The very next day, Lee Judson climbed to the 9th floor of an office building in Los Angeles. He jumped. He died from the fall. A man who had married Louise without ever knowing her true past was now dead too. Another casualty of a marriage he never should have entered. Margaret was gone. Arthur was gone. Now Judson was gone as well. Only one person connected to this house was still alive to answer for it. Louise Peete. Louise Peete's trial opened on April 23, 1945 in Los Angeles. Prosecutors laid out a clear motive: money. They argued that Louise had killed Margaret Logan to gain full control of the couple's finances. At the center of their case was a disputed check for $200, forged in Margaret's name. It was the same kind of paper trail that had first cracked open the case months earlier. The trial stretched on for weeks. Witnesses described Louise's shifting stories. Investigators laid out the autopsy findings. Piece by piece, the prosecution built a case that left little room for doubt. On May 31, 1945, the jury reached its verdict. Louise Peete was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury did not recommend mercy. She was sentenced to death. Court records describe a striking scene as that sentence was read aloud. Louise sat calmly with a philosophy book in her hands. She had been reading it before the verdict came in, and she barely reacted when it did. She looked up only once. She glanced at the prosecutor, and she smirked. Then she went back to her book. Over the next 2 years, Louise's lawyers filed appeal after appeal. Each one argued for a new trial, a lesser sentence, anything to delay the outcome. Each one was denied. The courts had made their decision. Louise Peete would face the consequences of what she had done. For nearly 2 years, Louise Peete sat on death row. Through every appeal, every delay, every passing month, she never admitted guilt. She maintained, right up until the end, that she had not killed Margaret Logan. She blamed Arthur. She blamed circumstance. She never once blamed herself. But time ran out. On April 11, 1947, Louise Peete was escorted into the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. She was 66 years old. Witness accounts describe what happened next. She was placed in a chair and restrained. The chamber was sealed shut. Cyanide was released into the air around her. Within roughly 10 to 13 minutes, Louise Peete was pronounced dead. She became only the second woman in California's history to be executed in the gas chamber. Think about everyone connected to this case by that point. Arthur Logan was already dead, gone months earlier at Patton State Hospital. Lee Judson was already dead too, having jumped from a building the day after his release. Margaret Logan, the woman who had shown Louise nothing but kindness, was dead as well, buried and forgotten for 6 long months. Of everyone touched by this house in Pacific Palisades, only one person was left standing to face a courtroom, a jury, and finally, a death sentence. Louise Peete, the woman who had spent her whole life walking away from the wreckage she caused, finally ran out of places to go. Louise Peete was buried at Angeles Rosedale Cemetery in Los Angeles. There was no fanfare. No family fought over her remains. She was simply put in the ground, quietly, the same way she had put her victims there. Margaret Logan believed in second chances. She spent her life giving them to people the world had given up on. That belief brought Louise Peete into her home. That same belief cost Margaret her life. Louise once opened a book while a judge sentenced her to die. In the end, that calm, that control, meant nothing. The gas chamber did not care how composed she looked. So we ask you now, out of everything in this story, what moment hit you the hardest? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more true crime cases like this one, hit subscribe, because the next story is waiting.